Good afternoon to our viewers, friends and supporters. I'm Sarit Zehavi from Alma Research and Education Center here in the Galilee. The Alma Center is a leading think tank about Israel's security challenges on the northern border. And we are here today to discuss how the civilian wing of Hizballah is actually the enabler of the military wing. So we are very happy that you are with us today. Just yesterday, there was kind of an exchange of fire between IDF and Hizballah terrorists along the border, in the eastern part of the border. IDF expected that some incident would happen with Hizballah and that Hizballah will try to attack IDF soldiers along the border. For those of us who are joining us now on Facebook Live, I'm Sarit Zehavi from Alma Research and Education Center. We are discussing today how the civilian wing of Hizballah is the enabler to the military wing. Yesterday, there was an incident on the northern border, an excellent example to how vulnerable the situation is, while we are first seeing a terrorist organization that do not acknowledge the existence of the State of Israel, a terrorist organization that is trying to build another front against Israel in Syria. And whenever Israel is trying to prevent that, something happens, we get tensions, attacks, fire on the northern border, including on the Israeli-Lebanese border. This is exactly what happened yesterday. A very vulnerable situation that can deteriorate into war very quickly. Today we want to discuss how the civilian wing of Hizballah, and I don't like the term wing because it's not two wings, it's one body. But actually how the civilian branch of Hizballah is the enabler for the military one. Since Hizballah is like a state within a state, it is everywhere in Lebanon, it is everywhere in the political system, finance system, and social system. In order to do so, we have with us today Dr. Levitt, who directs the Reinhardt program of counterterrorism and intelligence, and is a former Wexler Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Levitt has worked at the FBI and Treasury Department, teaches at Georgetown University, and is the author of Hizballah, the Global Footprint of Lebanon's Party of God. Matt, I'm so honored that you are with us today.
Sarit, it's a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to be able to do this with Alma. You guys are doing great work, literally on the front line in Israel's northern border with a frontline view. And so I appreciate the work you do, and it's a pleasure to be able to be with you today.
Thank you very much, Matt. So actually, Hizballah is involved in every aspect of life of the Lebanese: education, medicine, women's organizations, Boy Scouts and summer schools, environment, and financial assistance to the Lebanese. Today, we will only try to talk of a small part of these organizations of Hizballah. I would give just a small example about the COVID-19. Before we start, Hizballah led a campaign against the COVID-19 in Lebanon, meaning that it supplied test compounds and efforts to give information to the population and to supply food and nurses and doctors and medical treatment. And actually, it looks like that Hizballah was out there fighting the COVID-19 even more than the Lebanese government itself, though Hizballah also holds the health ministry in Lebanon. All of that was done by the Islamic Health Organization, which is an organization under, again, the civilian wing of Hizballah. The connection between the military wing and the civilian wing, when we speak about all these civilian infrastructures, is changing. Sometimes it is used to camouflage the military activity of Hizballah or to finance it, and sometimes it is the base for indoctrination, for creating, getting to the hearts and minds of people and actually creating the base of recruitment of the future generation to join Hizballah. Matt, I thought we can start with you with the more practical branches of the civilian wing, all these organizations that are actually using as the platform for camouflaging the military activity, and then the units that, or the organizations that are creating the finance base of, or the finance connection, if I may put it this way, between Hizballah and its civilians. So the floor is yours, Matt.
Thank you, Sarit. I'm going to take the opportunity to share my screen. What I'm going to do today is give you a sneak peek at the Lebanese Hezbollah Select Worldwide Activity interactive map that I've developed, which is launching on Monday. I'm going to take the opportunity just to show you some examples that highlight the points we're making here, which is that there are no distinct differences between the wings of Hezbollah and the ways in which Hezbollah social, let's call them non-expressly military as opposed to specifically civilian entities within Hezbollah function in a way that support Hezbollah operational activities. And you can use this map, by the way, for all kinds of things, to search Hezbollah activity in a particular place or to look up a particular theme. As of right now, it has 888 entries in it. We're going to be launching it with about 1,000. So just to start off and make the point, I think it's more useful if I don't make the point, and we just let Mohammed Hassan Ra'ad make the point for us. Mohammed Ra'ad, of course, is one of the top Hezbollah parliamentarians. So it doesn't get more political wing, if you will, than this. But in 2001, he made it very, very clear and said, and I quote, "Hezbollah is a military resistance party. There is no separation between politics and resistance." So countries and multilateral organizations and pundits can choose to make up a distinction that doesn't exist. But we look a little foolish when we do that, simply because whether it is this Deputy Secretary General, Hezbollah Naim Qassem, or here, Mohammed Ra'ad, Hezbollah officials themselves have made it clear that such a distinction does not exist for them. And so I think it's important to state this outright, because for them, the whole point we're making today is an obvious one. Well, of course we use our civilian infrastructure for the purpose of military activities or terrorist activities or vice versa. That's the point of having different types of activities, I like that better than wings, that support one another. But there are many ways in which this theme comes up, and let me give you a couple. So, for example, consider Beit al-Mal. The U.S. Treasury Department designated Beit al-Mal basically as Hezbollah's treasury in September 2006. And when they did this, they revealed that this is a financial entity that operates under the direct supervision of Hezbollah Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah. It's was the main finance body for Hezbollah. But tellingly, like, Hezbollah knows that it needs to do things surreptitiously. It knows that it's engaged in illicit conduct. So it created something called the User Company. And by the way, you can see the picture more clearly, and we have all of the documents here as well. When we launch this, you'll be able to see everything for yourselves. All the documents are here for you to review. They created a User Company, which was effectively a bank, but not a brick and mortar bank. It was a file in a drawer in someone's desk, in someone's office. It was an entity. But User Company was a major way through which Hezbollah was moving all of its finances. And other banks in Lebanon would maintain accounts that would say YC, User Company, and then have an account number. And this way, Hezbollah was able to maintain accounts in its own institution within Lebanese financial institutions. And this theme continued, of course. You may be familiar, for example, with Cardal Hassan. Treasury then designated Cardal Hassan in 2007. This is now being expressly used as a cover for Hezbollah's financial activity. And people are using this as a way to assume a greater role within Hezbollah's financial infrastructure without the public knowing about it. It's not just that Hezbollah uses kind of civilian institutions to hide its finances, to kind of enable it, money being fungible, to collect money for what seems to be more legitimate purposes and then disperse it for whatever purposes it wants. It does this not only through financial institutions, but of course it does this through institutions as well, through companies as well. So consider, for example, Jihad al-Binna, Hezbollah's primary construction company, designated by U.S. Treasury in February 2007. And when Treasury did the designation, they revealed that not only is this entity run by and overseen by Hezbollah's governing Shura Council, but that the Shura Council uses Jihad al-Binna, quote, for deceptive means to seek funding for projects from the international development organizations. So you could be the most professional bank, you could be the most professional development company that wants only to do good things for Lebanon, to help the Lebanese people, but you don't want to be involved in terrorism or military activity. And it'll be very, very hard for you to know that, because Hezbollah is deploying cover businesses specifically to get international business for their activities. And that did not stop with Jihad al-Binna. We then had the Wa'ad project, which was another of Hezbollah's construction projects meant to do the exact same thing. Now, so far I haven't given you incidents of exactly ties to the militant activity. So let's go back to where we started with Mohammed Ra'ad. Mohammed Ra'ad is a parliamentarian. He's part of the overt entity of Hezbollah. But when the U.S. Treasury designated him, they revealed that in 2017, he was meeting regularly with people like Adam Hussein Tabaja, who is a very senior Hezbollah financier overseeing what is arguably, together with Abdullah Safiuddin, Hezbollah's representative in Tehran, the most significant Hezbollah weapons procurement, illicit finance, narco trafficking, and money laundering network that Hezbollah runs. And he was meeting also with Hussein Ali Faour, who is an operative of Hezbollah's Islamic Jihad organization, that is to say, the terrorist wing of Hezbollah. But that's not all. When they designated him, they also revealed that the parliamentarian, this leader of this civilian wing of Hezbollah, was in regular business with people like Wafiq Safa. Wafiq Safa, of course, is a senior security official for Hezbollah in Lebanon. What type of activity was Mohammed Hassan Ra'ad engaged in with Wafiq Safa? The two of them were identifying a list of 100 Lebanese Hezbollah members who could be sent abroad to acquire foreign citizenship for the specific purpose of them being able to use that foreign non-Lebanese citizenship to conduct long-term missions in Arab and Western countries. So there's nothing political, there's nothing social, there's nothing legitimate about that. This is not the only parliamentarian to engage in this type of activity. So Amin al-Shari, another parliamentarian, pictured here with the late Qasem Soleimani, was also designated by the Treasury. And it turns out that one of the things Amin al-Shari was doing was, in response to US and other international sanctions, trying to help the Lebanese government protect the Lebanese financial system from abuse. Things like Hezbollah banking, depositing the proceeds of money laundering, narco trafficking, and other things within the Lebanese financial system. Think, for example, of the Lebanese-Canadian bank fiasco. Amin al-Shari was going up to people and threatening them. He was not going up to the banks themselves. He was not even only going up to bank employees. He was going up to their family members and threatening the family members of Lebanese bankers. You better make sure that your spouse or family member facilitates Hezbollah banking through these Lebanese banks, or else bad things could happen to you. This is not civilian, it is militant, but it is something that is being carried out by the overt side of Hezbollah. And now I want to bring you very much, as far as I'm concerned, to today. But to do that, I'm going to show you something from last year. So as Sarit said yesterday, there was some very serious tension along the blue line, along the Lebanese-Israeli de facto border, in part because the IDF carried out an attack in Syria that killed a Lebanese Hezbollah operative, and this for Hezbollah is a significant, the significant line in the sand. The last time this happened was in August 2019. And a few days later, on September 1st, 2019, Hezbollah fired 3 Kornet anti-tank missiles from within Lebanon, from Maruna Ras and Aitarun within Lebanon, into Israel, between the communities of Avivim and your own. Mind you, Hizballah only publicly claimed responsibility for and released the video for 2 of these rockets, and that's because the 3rd one was a very, very bad shot and they weren't particularly proud of it. What's important here, if you look at this map, you'll have a little bit of a better sense. The rockets are fired from these 2 positions. The Israeli military ambulance is at this point in the road between Avivim and your own. What's important here is that these 2 positions are positions of Hezbollah's Green Without Borders environmental organization. And what transpired is that Hezbollah has been using Green Without Borders to set up a series of lookout posts along the border to spy into Israel, to frustrate and thwart UNIFIL and other UN patrols to fulfill their obligations under UN Security Council Resolution 1701. And in September 2019, to actually fire the Kornet rockets from Green Without Borders positions. These were Green Without Borders platforms here in Aitarun and Maruna Ras, and using them literally for military purposes. Now, I just want to conclude with one thing, now that I've taken it a little bit close to today, and give you one piece of history, because there's lots of interesting historical bits in the map, because we've been able to include lots of not only unclassified but declassified information, a lot of declassified CIA reporting. And so I think it's important to note that what we're seeing here is not new. When Hassan Nasrallah is overseeing the Shura Council, he's overseeing the Jihad Council, he's overseeing all of the various councils, and their interoperability is part of the plan. What's interesting is to note that back in July 1992, before he was particularly well known, the CIA memo was reporting that it should be known that before he took over the position of Secretary General, Nasrallah was known to be directly involved in many Hezbollah operations himself, personally. The reports are here. You'll be able to review them for yourself. In this case, of course, it's a redacted report, but it's all right here. This is not something new. This is not something coincidental. This is something that is intrinsic to the nature of Hezbollah. So let me stop there and turn it back over to you, Sarit. And then when it's time, I'm happy to answer any questions people may have. You're muted.
Thank you very much, Matt. This was fascinating. And of course, the map that you've shown us is a huge and amazing project that, of course, will be very useful for researchers of Hizballah around the world, and, of course, in the campaign against Hizballah in order to stop its getting the control over Lebanon. I think that in order to be capable of creating such a stronghold in Lebanon, as you described, Hizballah needs more than frightening the people. And you mentioned the fact that they threatened the bankers in Lebanon. And part of the Hizballah project is what we call the indoctrination project. Many of Hizballah civilian organizations are actually meant to get to the hearts and minds of the people and to create a situation that a person in a community has nowhere to turn to except to Hizballah when he needs community services, education, etc. As an appetizer to what I'm going to say, I just want to show a photo that was published yesterday around the incident on the border. And the photo from yesterday is this is the mother of the Hizballah fighter that was killed in Syria last week in an operation that was attributed to Israel. She's like covered with a Hizballah flag yesterday afternoon, Middle East times. And she's giving candies to people in the street in her town in South Lebanon for the fact that Hizballah allegedly revenged against the IDF the death of her son. What's the most interesting detail in the picture is this one. I hope that you can see my clicker. Khomeini poster on top. And anywhere you go, you see Iran, you see Khomeini or Khamenei, and you see the Islamic Revolution. It's just out there anywhere you go. So that's the main, I think, value of indoctrination. It's the value of the Islamic Revolution and radical interpretation of the Shia. And the authority of the supreme leader in Iran is the only authority that we can trust and we should turn to. So, last 2 weeks ago, Alma published a huge report. For the first time, a civilian organization published 28 launching sites of Hizballah inside Beirut, in a very crowded area in Beirut. And I'm not going to discuss this report in details. It's already on our website, and we had a webinar about that. But all I'm going to say is that when I try to tell people that Hizballah is using the population as human shield, the first question I get is, how come? How come mothers agree to sacrifice their children? How come people agree to what Hizballah is doing in Lebanon? And as you know, by the protesting that is going on in Lebanon today, they don't always agree. And the answer is always complicated. And part of the answer is this indoctrination project that I want to say a few words about. So this huge indoctrination project is dealing with few narratives and values that I think Hizballah is trying to indoctrinate. The first one is what Hizballah calls the golden triangle of the people, the army, and the resistance, while the resistance is Hizballah. And the idea of this golden triangular is to try to say Lebanese army is nice, but we are here as well, and both of us are legitimate. Actually creating one state with two armies, which is, of course, unacceptable. This is also meant to draw the support of non-Shiites to Hizballah and present Hizballah as the protector of Lebanon even better than the Lebanese army. And this, of course, was very much relevant in the past few years when Hizballah and the Lebanese army fought together against ISIS in the Lebanese-Syrian border. The second value is, as I mentioned, is the value of the Islamic Revolution, the loyalty to Iran. And the best example is this. After Soleimani's death, he was commemorated everywhere in the Shiite towns in Lebanon, on our northern border as well. What you see here is a sculpture of Soleimani that was based very close to the area where the rockets were launched last year, the incident that you've mentioned, Matt. And Soleimani is pointing at Israel. You can see the Israeli community is over here, just below, like saying, we're gonna get you back. There was a protest in Lebanon against this campaign of Hizballah commemorating Soleimani all over Lebanon. But bottom line is that the sculpture is there and Soleimani's posters are there along the border. Two more values that is important to mention is what we call shuhada or martyrdom. Children are educated from day one to sacrifice their lives for Hizballah. not for the sake of Lebanon, but for the sake of the Islamic Revolution values. And the last but not least is the hate to Israel and the United States. And again, this is just a small example, but there are many examples like that Hizballah is using any opportunity, sometimes which is not connected whatsoever to Israelis or Americans, to send these messages of hate against Israel and the United States. So in order to understand how this works, I want to, say a few words about few infrastructures or mechanisms of Hizballah. The first one is what is called a educational recruitment branch. An educational recruitment branch is separate from the educational system of Hizballah in Israel, which is separated from the governmental educational system in Lebanon. And this educational recruitment branch is focusing on what is happening around the school or around the university, which is teachers union and training the teachers and high escalation and professional union of the professors in the universities and academic committees and high schools and activities inside the schools, coordination of the youth department with other Shiite parties such as Alma, and even given more lessons of science, of regular studying for students that need help. This unit is doing workshops and religious ceremonies and helping with scholarship to extended students, and is creating meetings between students and Hizballah operatives or politicians or reporters, anything that can help indoctrinating the values that I've mentioned. A lot of sport competitions and meetings about and national events for national days, and of course assistance to students either with money or with lessons. Here is another example of high school in El Khiyam, a Shiite town very close to the border with Israel. A lecture of Hizballah operative wearing uniforms, armed by the way, in a way which is contradicted to the United Nations Security Council resolution, in an area where it shouldn't be armed, giving a lecture in the school. While, by the way, you can see on the wall there a poster of Nasrallah, Imad Murnia, and Abbas Musawi, Hizballah leaders and former leaders. The goal of this education recruitment branch is to prepare the country to become the country of Imam Mahdi. I'm just quoting from the official documents. And create an identity between the knowledge, the jihad, the education, the faith, all in order to serve the mukawama, the resistance. So that's the main goal. Eventually, for the long term, it can take decades to create the country of Imam Mahdi. Imam Mahdi, it's the name of the Messiah in the Shiite belief, that one day will come back as one of the descendants of the Muhammad and the leader of the Shiite sect. And as you can see in the next slide, most of the efforts when we speak about education, and this was a research in Alma, it was made 2 years ago, and we checked almost 500 activities of this educational recruitment branch, and we've seen that most of them were dealing with Shiite values, how to indoctrinate Shiite values. That's the base to everything else. Most of the activities, by the way, were to the audiences of the educators in high school and students. Actually, those who are about to be recruited to Hizballah, the main audience that is important, and those who are educating them. Another example is El Mahdi Boy Scouts. Now the problem is, it's exactly as you said, Matt, with the finance system. El Mahdi Boy Scouts is an acceptable member of the World Boy Scouts. And there is cooperation between the World Boy Scouts and El Mahdi Boy Scouts, which is the Boy Scouts movement of Hizballah. Except the values that Hizballah is educating these youth is completely different than the values of the World Boy Scouts. And again, these are Shiite values. These are not values of freedom and equality. These are values of radical religious belief and militarism, and again, hate to Israel and promotion of the Islamic State revolution, and admire of the supreme leader of Iran. By the way, Iran is the main source of finance to these El Mahdi scouts, though people are paying, and the local authorities are also paying to be part of the movement. The movement is active by a license from the Education Ministry in Lebanon. Unfortunately, no American sanctions against this, though the education there is, as I've said, very problematic, and it is subordinate to Nasrallah. And again, they have sports activities, they have mobile libraries with a lot of propaganda for the children, and activities to prepare the youth of 16 and 17 to become members of Hizballah. The same youth that are joining Mahdi's Boy Scouts at the age of 8, when they become 16 or 17, they are joining the military branch of Hizballah. With 2 words, because our time is short, I would just mention another organization, which is under the name of women's organizations. And, you know, I believe that it's all about the women, of course. And women's organization is highly important, because what is actually happening is that they recruit volunteers from the community to spread or to be part, they are part of all over the community, and that way Hizballah is everywhere. Everything that happens in the family, Hizballah is aware of that, whether there is a moment of joy or a moment of grief, and you need to arrange when somebody, a funeral, or you need to arrange a wedding, Hizballah's women will be there to help, either to cook or to arrange or to transfer messages or to transfer information about who is loyal to Hizballah and who is less loyal to Hizballah. So the formal goal of women's organizations, again, is to invest in creating the belief or creating the believers in this Shiite, radical Shiite interpretation of Islam. But actually, when you see how they are operating, you understand that this is Hizballah's way to create its social network in the communities in a way that a Shiite person cannot run away from that. And if you understand how the Shiite society is built, it is a very traditional society. It is a very tribal society, meaning that everybody knows everything about everybody. And that way, the women's organizations are becoming like a social spy network that can transfer information about each family, and making sure that in each family you have somebody that is loyal to Hizballah and that will represent Hizballah in front of the community. Matt, I must ask you a question, you know, before we go to the Q&A. I'm usually being asked, where does the money come from? We know that the sanctions put a lot of difficulties to these civilian infrastructures of Hizballah. We see also complaints from the population. But how come they're still doing that? How come they were the one who led the COVID-19 campaign? Can you say a few words about the system, about the financing system of Hizballah?
So in short, you know, Hezbollah has 3 primary sources of revenue. The first and the most significant, even now, even under conditions of sanctions and coronavirus and a precipitous drop in the price of oil, all of which have affected Iran's ability to finance illicit conduct to a certain extent. Despite all that, Hezbollah continues to get the most significant amount of money and other type of support from Iran. According to the US government, at least prior to the coronavirus and the current financial crisis that Iran is facing, that support was somewhere in the realm of $700 to $800 million a year. Probably not all of it in cash, probably some of that is in material weapons and other things, but obviously a tremendous amount of money. And of course, a group like Hezbollah only needs money like that when they are taking on large infrastructure costs. It doesn't cost a lot of money to dispatch an operative. But if you're trying to not just be a terrorist group, but to have a standing army that is larger and better funded than the Lebanese armed forces, if you are trying to maintain a parallel education system, health system, education system, for the reasons that you mentioned, as well as environmental and educational and women's organizations to do things like what we discussed about Recruitment Without Borders, that takes more money. The second area of financing is Hezbollah's ability, by virtue of being, whether you like it or not, part of the fabric of Lebanese politics and society, and on top of that being part of the Lebanese political system, part of the Lebanese government, in control, for example, right now, as you mentioned, of the health ministry. Hezbollah is in a position to be able to leverage its position in Lebanon for financial gain. And a lot of that, not all of it, but a lot of that has to do with corruption. Now, let's be clear, Hezbollah is not the only corrupt entity in Lebanon. You will not find political leadership within any of the confessional elements of the Lebanese society that are not involved in corruption. That is at the heart of the problem of Lebanon's economy and political reality right now. But Hezbollah is very much involved in such corruption as well. And they play that in a very expert kind of a way. And finally, Hezbollah is complicated because it is multiple things at the same time. And people tend to have a hard time wrapping their heads around it. But I thought they're a political party. But I thought they're involved in education. But I thought you said that they were deployed as a military in Syria. What do you mean they're blowing things up in Bulgaria? Well, on top of all those things, yes, Hezbollah is a political party and a social welfare actor and a charitable actor and a militia, standing militia, and a terrorist organization. It is also a transnational organized criminal enterprise. And Hezbollah has gotten more and more and more involved in major financial and other types of crime around the world. In particular, not producing narcotics, but helping to transport narcotics, narco trafficking, helping to launder the proceeds of narcotics, massive money laundering, and a variety of other types of criminal enterprises, many but not all of which involve also, through those same connections to a broader criminal underworld, efforts to procure weapons, specific types of small arms weapon systems for their fighters, in particular in Syria. And so you look at the case of Mohammed Nuruddin, convicted in a court in Paris, part of what was Operation Cedar, a joint investigation by US Drug Enforcement Administration and 7 different European countries, and a host of other cases over and over and over. Most recently, the extradition from Cyprus of Rassam Diab, a Lebanese massive money launderer, accused of being a Lebanese money launderer for Hezbollah, now in US custody in Florida, and a host of other recent cases. In fact, because of some of these cases, Iman Kobeissi, Joseph Azmar, Iman Kobeissi arrested in the United States, Joseph Azmar in Paris, and many others, we've been able to collect tremendous amounts of actual evidence of their activities, where they're doing their activities. Iman Kobeissi gave tremendous information. And so there's a lot of understanding, and there's a tremendous amount of money to be made in this. Of course, it is also their Achilles heel right now, because now they are exposing themselves to additional law enforcement scrutiny, not only because of their terrorist and military activities, but also because of their black on white, simply criminal activities that happen to be criminal activities to support terrorism.
So I think we can conclude that Hizballah today is not leaning only on the Iranian financing. It has developed more ways of income from Lebanese that are living outside of Lebanon.
It's Lebanese outside of Lebanon, and that's something that's been going on for a very long time, trying to get money from Lebanese diaspora communities. That's done in two different ways. One is leveraging the financial empires of wealthy expatriate Lebanese who are Hezbollah supporters to use their companies as cover for Hezbollah. Look at the activities of the Tajuddin brothers, of Mohammed Bazi and his son Wa'el Bazi, Nizar Ahmad, Salah Asi, all of whom have been designated by the US Treasury. Some of them resident in Lebanon with businesses around the world, most of them with dual nationality in countries like Belgium and in France. But the other thing is taking advantage of taxing, I would say extorting, mafia-style shakedowns sometimes of diaspora communities. We've seen this in the tri-border area of South America. We've seen this in communities across West Africa, where Hezbollah will go up to a store owner. Sometimes it's simply saying, look, here's a collection box for Hezbollah, something like the Islamic Resistance Support Organization, one of Hezbollah's most famous quote unquote charities, though they also advertise collecting money for the cost of bullets and rockets. You know, terrible things. People could knock out the windows of your store, but if you put this collection box here, no one will touch you. And sometimes much more aggressive extortion than that. So leveraging the diaspora community, both by pressuring them, by accepting the donations of those who willingly give them, and increasingly leveraging the financial empires of Lebanese businessmen in the diaspora who support Hezbollah, sometimes even Hezbollah providing the initial funds to start a business so that it can serve that way is a significant issue. And by the way, today, arguably one of the most important financial cash cows for Hezbollah is not in the tri-border area and is not in West Africa, but is Iraq.
Explain a few things when we speak about the Shiite militias there, huh?
And this is how they have such fantastic access. But Hezbollah runs a tremendous number of businesses in Iraq. The U.S. has designated Mr. Kauthorani, who's one of the most senior Hezbollah political people and is overseeing things from the political side. And then there are several people from the military side, militant side, who are overseeing Hezbollah activities in Iraq now. They're much smaller militant Hezbollah presence in Iraq than during the war. And that's because, again, Iraq today is most important for Hezbollah as a place for them to make money.
Okay, let's go to some questions. There is a question here, what would it take to free Lebanon from the Iran and Hizballah influence? I must say something about that. Maybe I'm a dreamer, I don't know, but I think that the only way to do that is the long way, the expensive one, and we need a lot of patience to do that, but that's the only way. And I'm speaking about creating an alternative civil society organizations. I think that both in Iran, in Syria, in Iraq, in Lebanon, these radical ideologies, by the way, it doesn't matter whether they are Sunni or Shiites, are gaining support because they are investing a lot of efforts in gaining this support, as I've shown today. And I think that many people in these countries actually don't have any alternative to turn to. They don't get these services from any other source, from any other moderate ideology. I don't even want to say Western ideology. So the only way is to create civil society alternatives, but they can't be American, they can't be Israelis, they must be local. You know, as Hizballah, you just explained in details how Hizballah is using ex-Lebanese to launder money and to get finance. I'm saying, okay, ex-Lebanese should be recruited to the effort to save Lebanon and to create an alternative of civil society organizations, because the Shiites today in Lebanon don't have anybody else to turn to. Even with Alma, it is actually becoming a partner of Hizballah, when we try to trace alternatives, we've seen more and more cooperation between Ammon and Hizballah. Another question that I see here is how can the US support Lebanon without effectively supporting Hizballah? I think this is a question for you.
With difficulty. That's a simple answer. Look, Hezbollah is not Lebanon. Hezbollah is part of Lebanon. Hezbollah has the ability to penetrate parts of the Lebanese government, and it has successfully. It has not penetrated all of it. I am not one of those people that believes that we should be cutting off support to all of the Lebanese armed forces, for example. The Lebanese armed forces are not doing everything they can. They are problematic, and parts of them have been infiltrated by Hezbollah.
Right.
I also do believe that the Lebanese armed forces are the only glue that's holding this country together, and that there are parts of the Lebanese armed forces and certainly parts of the other security services that have actually done some good things, and we should be empowering them to do more. We can't simply sit back and say, listen, you need to be better, without recognizing how incredibly difficult that is for those who want to take on Hezbollah within Lebanon. It's very hard. Hezbollah is the strong man. They have a very capable intelligence service. They have more weapons. They are better trained than the Lebanese armed forces, the police, and the security services combined. So I do think we need to do a couple of things, and arguably the most important is to create conditions based on international standards that Lebanon as a government has to adhere to in order to be part of the community of nations. We have sat back and tolerated a situation where we've done Lebanon no favors by saying we're not going to get involved, and we've allowed Hezbollah to penetrate and take over more parts of society and government. Look at what's happening right now, and not only because of Hezbollah, but in large part because of Hezbollah activities. The Lebanese financial system is in a tremendously difficult situation, as is the political system. Again, not just Hezbollah, but Hezbollah has played a very, very nasty role in all this. And the number one actor right now that is preventing the Lebanese government from being able to accept the very basic standard conditions, nothing special for Lebanon, that the IMF and the World Bank are demanding for transparency, anti-corruption. Who's opposing this? Hezbollah. Because this would undermine Hezbollah's ability to leverage the Lebanese financial system, to leverage the corruption within the Lebanese financial system to its own, Hezbollah's own financial gain, not Lebanon's, but Hezbollah's. And so I think that we do Lebanon a favor. And I've had Lebanese officials say this to me when we put in place banking regulations and other regulations, and then they're able to go and say, listen, we have no choice. If we want to be able to do transactions in dollars, if we want to be able to have connections with other banks around the world, we have to live up to these standards. And that empowers them to be able to do things in a situation where otherwise Hezbollah won't tolerate it.
Okay, let's move on. There is another interesting question here. Is Lebanese society really divided according to the Christian, Sunni, and Shia populations? I would say yes. What do you say?
Absolutely. The divisions within Lebanese society are very, very real, but we should not oversimplify them. So I think it confuses some people that some of the most powerful Christian parties and militias are aligned with Hezbollah. That's not because they are Shia militants. They are not. They are Christian. But in the divided sectarian political system that is Lebanon, they see hitching their wagon to Hezbollah as the best way of protecting the interests of their community.
Right.
Let's also be very, very blunt.
It's all about surviveness over there. I don't believe that these Christians truly think that Hizballah is like the word of God or the party of God.
Not at all, but it's also true that it's not just a question of what the leaders of these parties think is best for their people. If I can be blunt, in some cases, it's what these leaders think is best for these leaders.
Right.
And there are certain individuals who decided that they have the best chance of becoming the next president of Lebanon if they ally themselves with Hezbollah, and a pact with the devil is just fine if that's what will further their political careers.
Well, the case of Michel Aoun is truly fascinating because he was one of the main opponents to Hizballah and the Syrians in Lebanon, and then he became their partner. It's almost unbelievable. But yes, this is Lebanon.
One of the things I found in the map, looking at the declassified information, is exactly this type of shifting alliances. People who haven't followed this over the years might be surprised given how close Hezbollah and Syria are today. But when you get a chance to look at the map after we launch next week on Monday, take a look at some of the early entries, some of the CIA material on the extreme tension and even fighting between Syria and Hezbollah. At one point, Imad Mughniya has to flee because the Syrians are trying to grab him. At one point, Iran asks Hezbollah to carry out attacks targeting Syrian army forces, but Sheikh Fadlallah stops them from doing it for his own reasons. I mean, these alliances shift over time, and the ones we see today, which seem so strong, may not be quite so strong or there at all in the future.
Definitely, I totally agree that things are changing and are very flexible in this crazy Middle East. There is another question here. The IDF stated today that they believe that Hizballah will attack again in a just release statement. They just announced that according to a I'm sorry, I'm just reading it. According to a situational assessment, it was decided to reinforce the Northern Command with advanced fire system intelligence collections and special forces. How should Lebanon's government respond in light of the operating warnings by Bibi on down that Beirut will pay the price of the Hizballah's activities? I must say one thing. Hizballah is inside Beirut, as proven also, as I've mentioned by our report 2 weeks ago. Hizballah is there. If there will be an escalation, Israel will not target Beirut just to target Beirut. Israel will target Beirut in order to defend Israelis, because Hizballah will launch from Beirut, either against IDF ships or Israeli civilian infrastructures or military bases. And I think when our leadership is saying very clearly that Lebanon will be greatly damaged by any escalation, what actually they are trying to say is that the fact that Hizballah is using its population, its human shield, is bringing us to this situation that we will have no other choice, but in order to defend ourselves, we will have to attack those missiles that are hidden inside the cities, including inside Beirut. There was another interesting question here when we started about the Christians, and I think we'll end up with this question. How much influence does the Christian monetary have, if any? Matt, would you like to take?
I'm sorry, how much does the what?
Does the Christian minority, I'm sorry, I misread it, but how much influence does the Christian minority? First, I'm happy that it was phrased this way, that it's a Christian minority, because many Israelis, for example, believe that they are still the majority. How much influence do they have, if any influence, about what's going on?
It's a great question, and the answer is that there is some real influence, but it is limited. I do think that if Christian parties that are allied with Hezbollah were to break that alliance, certainly even if they were to put some conditions on that alliance, it would have a constraining effect on Hezbollah. Hezbollah is controlling the government through its allies. It's the Hezbollah-controlled alliance, political alliance, that is dominant within Lebanon today. It's not the case that Hezbollah's, as a party itself, did so well in the elections as to take over the government. They did well as a coalition with other, in particular, Christian parties. That said, these parties are small. They can face pressure from Hezbollah themselves. There is an opportunity today, however, given the very severe, very real political and much more importantly, economic realities of the crisis in Lebanon. Certain Standard & Poor's, I forget which of the financial industry entities downgraded the economy to C, which is the lowest rating, for parties to ally together, even parties that are not in the same political bloc, and say, look, enough is enough, simply because people are suffering. Unfortunately, because of the extent of elite corruption in Lebanon, instead you have a situation where the elites across all of the sectarian parties are simply trying to sneak as much of their own money out of the country as possible. There's been tremendous asset flight. And there's a distinct lack of interest in looking out for the average Lebanese citizen. So I would push for a kind of cross-sectarian party effort to come up with standards by which all in Lebanon will behave, unlike the Taif Accords, which said everybody except for Hezbollah has to behave in a certain way. Everybody has to give up arms except for Hezbollah. This would be everybody. And then hopefully Lebanon would be able to actually get the IMF World Bank money that it desperately needs and that it should get. The Lebanese citizens, the average Lebanese person, none of us should be happy or okay with the situation that they're living in right now. But there's very little that the rest of us can do about it so long as Hezbollah puts roadblocks in the way of the Lebanese government's ability to accept those funds.
Well, Matt, thank you very much for joining us today. I think the topic of the civilian infrastructure of Hizballah as the enabler of the military one is highly important, and this is the way the terror, by the way, any terror works in order to gain support inside the population and hide its activity from inside populated areas. I also want to thank the Center for Terrorism and Intelligence after Mayor Amit for some of the materials I've used today, especially with regard to Imam al-Mahdi Boy Scouts. And of course, before we end, Omri, if you can share us with the details of Alma, you are invited to subscribe to our website or follow us on social media to read what we are publishing. Matt, thank you very much for being with us today. Hoping to see you soon. Later this week, we will publish a short video about what is happening on the northern border of Israel in the past week. It is still ongoing. So see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Sarit. Take care.